Hi, I'm Ron. Thanks for checking this out. I've not posted anything new for a while, so if you've been waiting for something, thank you for your patience. And especially my apologies to anybody who was kind enough to leave comments or questions on previous videos and I just didn't get to them. I've been involved in a musical project that I'm really very excited about, and the deadline ended up being a little tighter than I expected, and it became all absorbing for a while. But that project is now in a place where I can start doing some other things in addition, and so we're back here today. Now I'm going to be making some videos about that project because it's a really cool thing, and it actually does involve the song that I was just playing as we came in. But today, as usual, we're going to talk about flutes. And today we're especially interested in this business end where we blow. Now, a lot of wind instruments, no matter how different they might look from one another, how different they might sound from one another, what they basically boil down to is being a tube that we blow into. And that tube is enclosing a column of air. And if we blow into our tube the right way, we get beautiful musical sounds out. So what we want to look at today are some of the different options we have up here at the business end of our flute that actually affect how we might get air into the flute. So let's look at some of our choices. Now, when wind players use the word embouchure, that's just a fancy French-sounding word that means what do we have to do with our mouth to make our instrument sing properly? And what you have to do here, the changes can look subtle, but are sometimes really quite profound depending on what kind of instrument you're playing. Now, I don't care whether you call this an indigenous flute or a Native American flute or a Native American style flute. And I understand that those different designations can be useful in some situations. But whenever we use them as a blanket term, it suggests a uniformity in construction and tuning and a lot of other things that simply is not real, either historically or in the present. And one of the places where there's a lot of variety in the way our flutes are constructed is right up here. So we're going to look at a number of different flutes from my collection that have different kinds of mouthpieces that make subtle changes in what's going on with our embouchure. And you need to find a flute that feels comfortable and workable for you. And part of that is about what's going on here. So let's look at some different flutes. This is my very first Native American style flute, kind of my grandmother flute. I've had her for a very long time. Made in Cedar by Scott Loomis back in the day. And as you can see on the close-up, the mouthpiece end of this tapers down almost to a point, and the blowhole is actually very, very small. So it's not unlike the end of a straw, really. Of course, the air is going the other direction here, but to get air into the flute well, I actually have to take the end of the flute into my mouth a little bit and then use my lips to create a seal around the tube. Now, this was my only flute for the first year that I was playing, and I was playing it 2 or 3 hours every day, so I got really accustomed to that sensation of having the end of the flute a little bit into my mouth and using my lips to create that seal. And then just about the very next flute that I got was this flute by Butch Hall. And you can see that it's very similar. As you see the close-up of it, you see it also tapers down almost to a point, and that it also has a very small blowhole. So that was a sensation that I was really familiar with, and really it took a while even to be aware that there were other options available. Now, you can actually hear the Butch Hall flute in action on some of my early recordings, especially Heartbeats of the Forest World. And if you enjoy Jeff Ball's tracks, and who doesn't, I know Jeff played a lot of Butch Hall flutes back in the day, so you've probably heard his flutes on some of Jeff's tracks as well. Let's look at some other options. This very striking flute was made for me by J.P. Gomez, and it's made from Black Walnut. Now, if I compare the mouthpiece end of this to my grandmother flute, the Scott Loomis flute, you can see that they're a very distinctive looking end, right? This looks a bit more tapered, and we already talked about this being a little bit more like a straw. But if I turn this flute towards you, you will see that it still has a very, very small opening, just like the Loomis flute. So, just like the Loomis flute, I actually have to put this flute into my mouth a little bit to get it to play, right? So I have to bring it in and form a seal. Now, it feels slightly different from the Loomis, but it has that similarity that it actually goes down into the mouth just a wee little bit. Now, this is a flute from Cherokee flute maker Danny Begay. It's made from salvaged chestnut. There was a building being torn down in Danny's area, and there was some lovely old chestnut in it, and he grabbed it and turned it into some beautiful flutes. Now, you can see from a distance here, these flutes look very, very similar. They both have tapered mouthpieces. But here's a close-up, and I'd like for you to notice a really important difference as the flutes get turned towards you, that the Danny Begay flute has a much, much bigger blowhole in it, right? So that actually makes quite a difference in the way I get air into the flute. Instead of bringing the end of the flute into my mouth, I just put my lips up against that hole, and then air goes directly into the flute. So that's a significant difference. Now the flute is not in my mouth at all. My lips are just up against the flute. And here are close-ups of the different embouchures, so you can see it's a subtle difference, but it really feels quite different. This flute was made for me by my tribal brother, Jim Gilliland, and it is a rather traditional-looking Cherokee-style river cane flute. And as you see the close-up of the business end here, you'll see that Jim has done very little to the tube at all. He's just rounded the edges a little bit so that they won't cut the lips, and so it feels very comfortable. And just like with the Danny Begay flute here, I mean, the opening here is even bigger than on Danny's flute, and it makes it very easy for me to simply put the flute up to my lips. It doesn't go into my mouth at all. My lips just come up to the mouthpiece, and that allows me to shape my lips to control the airstream as it goes into the flute, which I have found to be very useful. And so this kind of opening feels very comfortable to me at this point. And this is a really lovely example of how that can be done. I probably should mention that all of the flutes that I've shown you today and will be showing you today, I've actually used in recordings over the years. So if you're interested in hearing any of these flutes in action, drop me a line and I can probably point you to at least a track or two where that flute is doing its thing. Now, this flute was made by Ken Light. It is Cedar, and it's kind of Ken's reconstruction of 19th century Lakota style flutes. If I get in close here, you can see that there's a metal spacer plate here in the windway. He's tweaked the tuning a bit to accommodate contemporary playing tastes. If you're familiar with R.C. Nakai's recordings, I think anybody who's listened to any Native American flute music is familiar with R.C.'s recordings. You've undoubtedly heard Ken Light's flutes because he's been R.C.'s primary flute maker from the get-go. Now you can see up here on the business end that this flute begins to taper, just like some of the other flutes that we've looked at, but unlike the Loomis or the Gomez, it doesn't come to a tiny little straw-like opening or a full taper. We have this little extension that sticks up here. Now this is, as you see a close-up of the flute here, you see this is actually too big to bring into the mouth. That really wouldn't be comfortable at all. So it kind of asks you to put your lips up to it, kind of like the Gilliland or the Begay flutes. But you see that the blowhole here is really, really tiny. It's a very tiny opening, so that in some ways, if you ever played trumpet, which has a very tiny little mouthpiece, it's not unlike that sensation that you're putting your lips up against a small area, and then the blowhole beyond that is even tinier. Now, if you've watched any of my flute instruction videos, you know that my go-to flutes are Colin Peterson flutes. I use a Colin Peterson in A for all of my instructional videos. And if I compare these side by side, you can see that in some ways they look similar. They begin to taper, but they don't come down to a real small area at the top. But as you see in the close-up, as I rotate the flutes towards you, there's a significant difference here. The blowhole opening on the Colin Peterson flute is much, much larger than the Ken Light flutes. And so, just like Danny Begay's flutes or Jim Gilliland's flutes, this invites you to simply put your lips up against the opening, and then I feel like I have the freedom to shape the airstream coming out of my lips in a lot of different ways, which over the years I have come to really appreciate, and I think that's maybe one of the reasons that I've been drawn to Colin Peterson's flutes as my primary flutes, along with all of their other wonderful features. Here's something else about Colin's flutes that I've really come to appreciate over the years. Here are two of his flutes. The big one is a low C, and the little one is a high C. You can see how much bigger the bore is on the low C. But as I turn them toward you, you see that the blowholes are the same size. So here is a panning shot over a variety of Colin's flutes, running from that low C flute that you just saw to the high C flute. And you'll see that all of the blowholes are essentially the same size. They're all about a 1/2 inch across. So that means no matter which of Colin's flutes I grab and start to play, it's going to feel essentially the same right here at my embouchure area. And I've really come to appreciate that over the years. I know that if I'm in the middle of playing a concert someplace or in the middle of a studio session, have to swap flutes, sometimes that even happens in the middle of a song, I know that when I get it to my mouth, it's going to feel the same way. And that makes a difference to me. May not make a difference for you, but it makes a big difference to me. It just kind of increases my comfort level all the way around. So, it doesn't matter whether I'm heading to the studio or going out to play a gig someplace. Now, I usually have Colin Peterson and Jim Gilliland flutes in my bag, because no matter which of them I pull out, I will have that kind of same sensation at the embouchure, and that feels good to me. But that's just me. What do you think? Do you have a preferred mouthpiece that is kind of your go-to style, no matter who made it? Or do you like variety, or does it just not make any difference to you whatsoever? Have you found an option that's different from any of them that I've shown you today? Let me know in the comments and questions. I personally love it that there's still a lot of variety in the construction and tuning of our flutes. It means that no matter what you're into, you can probably find a flute that was made just for you, and that's what matters. Okay, if you found this helpful, please hit those like and subscribe buttons. That really helps to get the word out. Maybe share it with a friend, maybe share it with your flute circle. Visit me on my website too, ronmoranmusic.com, and you'll find a lot of other stuff that's going on in my little neck of the musical world. So that's it for today, and I will see you again soon.